Rockstar Games' Red Dead Redemption has finally been released on PC, being ported by the team Double 11. A holy grail game for many that perplexingly has avoided the platform for no good reason for more than a decade. Has it been worth the 14-year wait? How does it improve over the console release? And lastly, how far can we push this game up and down? This game is retro, so does it run on retro hardware? I will cover all that and more in this video about Red Dead Redemption for PC. Given how so much time has passed since the initial release, I think a big aspect of this release on PC is preservation. The PC platform is the forever platform, where games live on for eternity. Does this port respect that aspect? I would say first impressions in this regard are rather poor. A game can hardly live forever when it requires multiple layers of DRM. First you have Steam, which is expected, but then you have the Rockstar Game Launcher, which will install on first boot and require you to log in with an account. Considering how this remaster does not even include the original multiplayer on any platform, I find it more than irksome that we need another launcher and another account for this game. I know this is not Double 11's decision, but still down the line, this extra layer of DRM will complicate the longevity of this game for preservation purposes. I have no doubt Steam will exist far into the future, but some Rockstar stuff? Of that I'm not so certain. So in this aspect, the port is not great, but beyond that aspect, the game's technical execution in this port on PC is generally on point. We have competent graphical options, mouse and keyboard support, which I exclusively played with for this video, and very quick shader pre-compilation, as yes, this is a DX12 release. On a technical level, I would say DX12 is a bit excessive for a game that was originally built for DirectX 9 level consoles, but at least there are no shader compilation related hiccups here, and it is smooth running. As for mouse and keyboard controls, they are serviceable and playable. My only issue is that the game's base gameplay systems themselves were quite obviously not designed around keyboard usage. For example, the default mechanic to sprint on horse or foot is rapidly tapping the sprint key, which per default is left shift in the port. Because of that, Windows thinks you're trying to activate sticky keys while playing this game. So the game will pause and you'll see that famous ancient pop-up while playing the game. Sprint and other game actions are thankfully rebindable to other keyboard keys, yet I'm a little bit perplexed as to why the devs made left shift the default here given how Windows sticky keys is a thing that's been around for so long. As for mouse control, I found it pretty good, with it being rather easy to aim and land shots that I would otherwise have struggled to make with a controller.
Slow down!
I see you, boy. Looks like that's all the sons of bitches.
The graphical options I would say are the best executed aspect of this port. You have arbitrary resolution support, variable aspect ratio support, and support for frame rates above 60. Well, mostly. It technically only goes up to 144 FPS by default. To go above 144 FPS, you'll have to download an FPS unlocking mod. Here I wish the porting devs took the release one step further. If modders can unlock the FPS easily above 144 so shortly after release, then I think the main release here could offer unlocked FPS, even if it means a disclaimer that values above 144 have not been thoroughly tested for issues. Beside that though, I would say I'm quite enamored with how the game supports different aspect ratios. With ultra wide, you get a perfect view of the game, where the horizons look incredible. It generally works well with the UI, and it only has one minus point really, and that is that cutscenes still render at 16:9 while you're in a wider aspect ratio. This is a bit sad, but it's understandable given the game's vintage. 4:3 also worked perfectly in my testing. The game's style, combined with those phosphor glows, pixel grid, and that general analog look of a CRT, makes a wonderful aesthetic. A game like this with its low-res textures and low-poly models honestly does not need too much resolution to look good. So some of the impreciseness of a CRT can actually be seen as a plus point in this game's presentation. Beyond that, you have dynamic resolution, upscaler choice, and the ability to turn down settings from Ultra. These settings offer some good scalability, and things like dynamic res are definitely well appreciated, but as we will see later when I get to performance, you don't really need to adjust these options too much, as pretty much any modern GPU and CPU will have little issue running this game maxed out at Ultra. And with that being said, let's talk about how the PC release looks next to the console one. Thankfully, those options I just talked about allow the game to scale quite a bit further than the console version. One of the first obvious areas is of course in frame rate. For example, as we see here, running at 4K 120 on PC versus the 60 FPS limit in the console version. Animations are smoother with less gaps, and camera motion is also less prone to issues. For example, in cutscenes, we noted on release of the console version of this remastering that the motion of the camera in cutscenes cannot be completely linear all the time, so sometimes camera movement would present unsmoothly. This is inherited into the PC release unfortunately, but at the higher frame rates, the issue is less noticeable due to the gaps of movement between frames being shorter in length and shorter in distance. Basically, the higher the frame rate is, the less obvious camera or animation error will be. This applies to most things, except for using the horse when you try and match speed with someone else you're riding next to. This still causes the camera to slow down and speed up in a visually distracting way, I would say. But that's just how the game's speed matching mechanism works and how it was designed. No frame rate can really fix that. The other obvious area you can push higher on PC is in resolution. 4K is fine and dandy on console, but what about 8K? Sure, why not? This is a bit silly, of course, as I mentioned earlier, as this game's vintage means increasing resolution has limited impact on the visual quality, but still, you can kinda do it if you really want to. You'll get better anti-aliasing as a result, and distant shots will look crisper than the console version, which runs at 4K and PS5 back compat. Honestly though, I think if you want to utilize GPU horsepower better in this game, you should spend it on frame rate or the Ultra preset. The Ultra preset is indeed the biggest plus point in this game versus what you have on console, as it dramatically increases the draw distance for nearly everything. As we can see in this comparison here overlooking the valley, the PC version increases the draw distance of grass, trees, rocks, shadows, and vegetation that populates the world, which now extend far into the horizon. The only thing that showcases obvious LOD transitions in the Ultra settings now on PC are buildings and characters as you approach towns. Those are gameplay driven level of details that are controlling AI and physics, so it is understandable that they cannot be pushed out so far. Generally, the view distance increase on PC makes a world of difference versus the console version, and in movement you'll see a lot less pop-in, like here, side by side going up the mountain in the game's intro. On PS5 backward compatibility, we see the hillside change level of detail rather close to the camera, and there's no such thing happening in the PC Ultra settings. This is nice to see, and I'm really happy the devs decided to push out the draw distance so much on PC. It is such an old game, and them allowing you to use excess CPU and GPU power for such a feature is great. Most LODs are indeed better on PC, but not everything is pushed out super far. Local shadow draw distance from point light or spotlights is not dramatically different on PC, so you will still see shadow pop in when you get close to any of the lanterns, lamps, and fires or torches in the game. Here's perhaps the only area where I wish they allowed you to push it out further in the Ultra settings, perhaps with a separate tab. Another area where the porting team did great is increasing shadow quality. For one, shadows can be higher resolution. You'll notice this with indoor spotlights like we can see here, where the shadows are tighter with less issues, and they'll be less prone to aliasing on movement, basically making the game look more temporally stable when maxed out. Another thing the devs did was make sure that shadows can be filtered in different ways. On console, as we see here, the sun shadows in particular are high res enough, but they're not particularly filtered well. The shadows are super hard edged. That is typical for Xbox 360 generation games, like when Red Dead came out, but it is a little odd looking at times for things like trees, as we see here. On PC, they offer different filtering modes, as we can see here, such as contact hardening shadows, which in comparison makes it so that shadows from the tree branches and leaves are soft the further away they get from the base of the tree, where the shadow is going to be sharper. In the end, this is a matter of taste, so if you do not like this shadow behavior, you can turn off CHS to high, which will make shadows universally soft with no contact hardening, or you can set shadow softness to low or medium down from high, which will be more in line with what you see in the console version. The last plus points for the PC version are anti-aliasing, image reconstruction, frame generation, and post-processing. For post-processing, motion blur is slightly higher quality on PC and even shows off a per-object blur occasionally in cutscenes, like we can see on the hands and gun here. That is neat, although I wish it could be toggleable to be added to gameplay as well. For image reconstruction, it is not at all necessary for this game's performance, but having things like DLAA is always great, and frame generation, while not really necessary, has potential to help out those lower spec computers get up into HFR territory in certain circumstances. But truly, as I mentioned earlier, most modern PCs won't really have to spend any time in the graphical options here, as running this game at high resolutions and high frame rates isn't such a problem. On the GPU side of things, this game runs at 4K 60 with DLAA on an RTX 4060, and that is a GPU that I do not even think is particularly good. On the high end, the GPU like the RTX 4090 can run the game at native 8K Ultra DLAA with frame rates between 80 and 110 FPS, depending on the scene. This game is very easy on GPUs, and I think no one will have any problems there. On the CPU side, it is a little different due to the jacked up LOD and draw distance when set to Ultra. There, people will have their frame rate options more limited depending upon the age of their CPU. For example, a Ryzen 5 3600 when set to Ultra settings can technically only be a little above 60 FPS in some of the denser scenes in the game. That is around towns where the NPCs and density of objects is highest, so the FPS there can be in the 60s, with some frame times being a little bit longer than 16.6 milliseconds. In the desertified areas with grass and cacti, the 3600 is untroubled even with that Ultra LOD on, with FPS in the 100 range commonly. That is a great level of variability though, so if you would want a constant 120 FPS on an older CPU like this one, then you would either have to turn the LOD range down below Ultra, or you will have to utilize frame generation to keep the FPS consistently high. On high-end CPUs like the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, it commonly runs at more than 2 times the frame rate of that aging Ryzen 5 3600. That means it's pretty much always over 120 FPS on Ultra, and the frame rates will be above 200 in the less challenging open areas with all the cacti and whatnot. As you can see on the frame time graph, the frame times are incredibly smooth and stable, with scarcely any issues to mention really. I played most of the game trying to lock at a 4K 120, and I only saw maybe 2 or 3 times where there was a small blip on the frame time graph where VSync had to drop because the frame time went above 8.3 milliseconds. It almost never happened though, and the frame times in general are very stable and very low on the high-end CPUs, even on Ultra settings, and that's all without any frame generation. So it runs well on modern PCs, and that's expected given how technically old this game is. Though I was really curious how low this game can actually scale, like to retro components. Red Dead Redemption was designed around the capabilities of the Xbox 360, which is a DX9 class GPU with a low core count in order CPU and only 512 megs of system RAM. Surely this game should also run really well even on old hardware. Well, as much as I would love to try and use components from 2005 when the Xbox 360 came out, this port's API choice as well as its release location limit that severely. Being on Steam means we're going to be on Windows 10, and being DX12 limits us to GPUs from around 2011 or so. My first attempt to try and run the game was on a GTX 570, which technically supports DX12, but the game rather arbitrarily requires 2 GB of VRAM as a minimum. This is a shame, and the game would not boot on that GPU. On my second boot, I was running instead a GTX 670, which is the successor to that GPU from 2012, which has 2 gigs of VRAM. That got past the error message, but I had made the fatal mistake of pairing it with an Intel Core 2 Duo E6600, a CPU from 2006, and loading in the game was incredibly slow, as the game port here is definitely not meant for dual-core CPUs, and it's also not meant for Windows 10 with dual-core CPUs. That much is for certain. It did get into the menu after about 6 minutes, and in-game 3 minutes after that, perhaps, but the game performance was just disastrous, as you might imagine. To make it better, I upgraded to a Core 2 Quad Q6600, which released in 2007, and there I saw much better results. The game was not in slow motion when trying to enter it, so the user experience was considerably considerably snappier. In-game performance though was iffy and bad, I would actually say. Even using the lowest settings at 720p, the game was almost never at 30 FPS, and the frame times were dire and very inconsistent. Moving across the game world saw big frame time spikes into the 90 millisecond range or higher constantly. On paper, a Q6600 is as fast as the Jaguar, more or less, found in the PS4, so it is underperforming in raw performance here heavily. Heck, it is underperforming heavily versus the PS3, which ran this game rather poorly back in the day. There could be many reasons why the CPU is performing poorly. Too little system RAM, as I was using 4 gigs here, too slow PCIe speed, which would be reasonable, or maybe the old GPU I'm using is not happy with their DX12 implementation. Either way, even though this game came out for the PS3 and Xbox 360, it is not good on hardware that was contemporaneous with those consoles. It's a shame, but it is the way it is. And on that slightly somber note, I want to mention a few less than positive things before I end this video. The first has to do with generally how the game looks on PC. For some reason, and I'm not sure why, it looks slightly different than the console version in color reproduction. Even at the same time of day locked as we see in the intro, I cannot help but notice how the PC version is producing different colors than the PS5 here. I captured both limited to limited, so I'm not sure why this is the case, but I could replicate it across different game scenes. This is not a bad thing per se, but it is a difference that is there. A real issue I noticed though when comparing console to PC is that some shadows and sunlight on PC do not render correctly while you're in cutscenes that take place indoor. Like here in the intro in the tavern. On console, we can see the sunlight outside the saloon doors here peeking into the entrance. On PC in that scene, for some reason, you cannot see them at all. When it switches over to gameplay, the shadow and sunlight are there on PC. They're just not there during the cutscene for some reason. I saw this happening in many cutscenes where the area outside looks gray and almost unlit on PC for some reason, like here when you meet Bonnie for the first time. I'm not sure what is causing this, but I think it is incorrect. Hopefully this can be fixed, presuming it is an error. And with that sentiment, I also want to say the same thing for the game's HDR implementation. I only tested it briefly and I was really unimpressed. I have heard from those knowledgeable on the matter that the HDR in this game is similar to the HDR in Red Dead Redemption 2, where it is SDR in an HDR container, which is not how HDR should be done. So hopefully 11 can look into that well in time for patches. With that being said, I'm at the end of my video here. This game is 14 years late on PC and it is kind of expensive at $50 US, but the Red Dead Redemption Remaster on PC largely hits the marks in terms of performance and graphical additions. It looks best on PC and it uses bigger GPUs and CPUs to make the most of it. The least agreeable aspect in the end is the Rockstar Launcher sign-in. That is needless friction and DRM, which I think is completely unnecessary and perhaps jeopardizes this game's longevity on the PC. I do not think that will change with future patches, but hopefully some of my minor gripes do change with patches in the near future. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell button for instant notifications, support on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.